We are living in uncertain times. This means individuals and organizations around the world are increasingly experiencing situations in which their health, wealth, and income are not well enough protected. Those gaps in protection have major consequences for the well-being and prosperity of individuals, businesses, and society. GFIA has identified and quantified the largest global protection gaps. Its research found 4 that are particularly significant due to their size, global presence, impact on livelihoods, and expected growth. They are insufficient retirement protection, an annual gap of $1 trillion, a lack of cover for cyber risks, an annual gap of $0.9 trillion, an absence of healthcare cover, an annual gap of $0.8 trillion, and insufficient cover for natural disasters, an annual gap of $0.1 trillion. GFIA's report looks at what is driving these gaps and examines the wide range of potential levers available to policymakers and insurers to help close them. A range of case studies illustrate how some of these levers have been used in practice. Finally, GFIA makes its own recommendations to policymakers of the initiatives that can have the greatest potential impact on unprotected risks.
Hello, I am Michaela Koller. I'm the Secretary General of the Global Federation of Insurance Associations, GFIA, and I'm here with GFIA's President, Susan Neely, and GFIA's Vice President, Tim Grafton, to tell you a little bit more about this major piece of research into the size and impact of gaps in protection and ways to reduce them. And my first question is directly to Susan. Susan, why did GFIA decide to research protection gaps and write this report?
Well, because GFIA, on behalf of our great global industry, wants to be part of the solution. Our world's changing at an unprecedented speed. It creates new challenges for all of us around the world. There are more and more situations in which people's health, wealth, their income is just not adequately protected. And gaps in protection have major consequences for the well-being and financial resilience of individuals, businesses, and society. As we in the insurance industry know well, because we don't just do this, we feel we have a responsibility to help find solutions to close those gaps. So this report is focused on exactly that. What was the best way we could come up with, and we believe it's the best way we could come up with, to really put some intellectual content on the table to engage consumers, policymakers, thought leaders, stakeholders. This is the first of its kind study to identify and quantify the largest global protection gaps. We found 4 areas of protection that have the most impact on people's lives: pensions, natural catastrophes, cybersecurity, and health. We put a dollar amount on each risk because there's nothing like the global compilation of what in the trillions or billions of what that risk will cost. We identified potential levers to reduce the risk. We believe this will help focus case studies to set up case studies to facilitate discussions. And we also came up with policy recommendations for that are put together by our experts around the globe to, again, help focus people on solutions. So that's a long answer to your question, Michaela, but we really want to advance real solutions to help close these protection gaps for people around the world.
Well, thank you, Susan, for this great introduction. Now a question to the two of you, and this time I would start with Tim, maybe. Tim, what in the report struck you most?
Well, the size of the gaps in financial terms is absolutely staggering at about $3 trillion across pensions, cyber, natural catastrophe, and health combined. But even that is a conservative figure. For instance, cyber protection. that covers total economic exposure, but it doesn't cover, for instance, reputational damage or business interruption continuity. So if you include those, the report actually quotes one estimate of $6 trillion in potential loss. And insurance, here's the staggering figure, insurance only covers $6 billion of that. That is 0.1%. So there's an enormous gap there that needs to be closed. In natural catastrophe, people have decided to locate themselves in ever increasing concentrations in larger urban cities. These are cities that were founded many years ago, near trade routes, but close to rivers, close to the sea, where with climate change, natural catastrophes now are going to exacerbate the risks that are there and that risk concentration. And unfortunately, in many parts of the world, our infrastructure is not sufficiently resilient to provide the protection that's needed against the advance of climate change with the increased frequency and severity of those events. So those two areas really stood out for me from this report.
And Susan, on your end, what surprised you?
Well, I think Tim captured it well, that the study overall is presenting the size and scope of global protection gaps in a way that I think drives home the challenge that we as a society face, we as insurers, we as policymakers, we as people. I'll focus on the pension gap that the report estimates is $1 trillion annually. And why the gap? Well, we looked at the factors that are fueling it. It's twofold. One is demographic changes that are putting unprecedented pressure on pension systems around the globe. Longevity, the global share of people over 65 grew from 6.8% in 2000 to 9.3% in 2020, increasing the demand for pension disbursements. And then falling birth rates. Fewer people in the workforce are contributing to support the public pension system, which puts them under more financial pressure. So those are the demographic challenges. Then we have growing standards of living, which is a good thing overall. GDP per capita doubled from 2000 to 2020, and then that's expected to grow around 50% by 2050, which again is a good thing. But that raises people's expectations, understandably, about what their quality of life should be when they move into retirement, which, as we've established, will probably be longer if they're healthy and they live longer. So these are the factors fueling the gap, and again, I think helps focus us on the problems are intensifying, and we need to do something about it.
Yeah, I mean, as you both have, I think, properly illustrated, the gaps are enormous. But Tim, can you tell us a little bit more about the key drivers of these protection gaps?
Well, at a very general level, obviously it will depend in each region on the level of exposure and level of vulnerability, but also lack of risk awareness, a lack of willingness to do something about it, or the lack of affordability issues that prevent people being able to close those gaps. But aside from that, there are those megatrends that are occurring that are also influencing factors. And Susan's just referred to the aging population and the growing size of middle incomes. But equally in the area of cyber, we have universal connectivity globally and the exponential increase in the use of data and business that's transacted in that way. And that just heightens cyber risks globally. So the number, severity, and complexity of the cyber risks is growing each year. And as I said before, insurance only covers a very, very small part of that. So that's a challenge. And obviously in the area of climate change over the years ahead, and we've seen many catastrophes around the world in recent years where extreme weather events have exceeded any historical precedents. So what we're seeing here is increased frequency and severity of events, and that is impacting people's lives and obviously their property, their businesses, and their well-being. So those are two key trends that are occurring. And then finally, on the macroeconomic and political level, there is great uncertainty out there. I think the introductory video sort of captures that level of uncertainty very well indeed. And that is driven by geopolitical issues. We've seen the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We've seen massive inflation around the world and following the pandemic. And also we're seeing and have seen supply chain challenges as well. So these issues also exacerbate the situation and drive protection gaps too.
You know, what I found really interesting now is also that the report contains a wide range of case studies. And I think they illustrate in a better way the real problem. But could you maybe shortly describe what we can learn from them, Tim?
The case studies, on one level, case studies are useful because they can provide insights into elements which could be potentially adapted by others. But the shortcoming of a case study, of course, is that it's quite specific to a region. So you just can't take what's happening in one region and transplant it straight into another one. But the number of case studies that were undertaken were ones that showed that there were areas of success, and where there are areas of success, the report usefully draws out generic tools that could be considered either by the private sector or by the public sector, or a mix of the two, in order to close protection gaps. And as Susan said at the outset, the solutions here don't rest solely with governments, they don't rest solely with the insurance sector, but it's that combination and getting that right that will help close the protection gaps. So, for instance, something like raising awareness and education about risks, that's probably fairly common right across all of those areas. But some tools are particularly tailored to regions. So in the area of natural catastrophe, the Pacific Islands and also islands in the Caribbean have multi-country parametric covers. Now, that's suitable for those regions, but it's probably not necessarily suitable in other regions. And so not all solutions are applicable in all markets, but everybody can look at those tools and think, what is it from this we could appropriately take for our region?
Well, Tim, you have already, alluded to the fact that this is a report that doesn't just only describe the gaps, but also contains recommendations. Susan, can you give us more insight into what can be done to close the gaps?
Well, I'm just going to continue to build on what Tim said. Narrowing the protection gaps has to be the shared responsibility of all of us. And in many ways, we see this report as sort of a call to action by putting so much of the best thinking in one place around these four gaps. It gives us a focal point to just galvanize everybody's concern and efforts. We'll do our part. Insurers can, and we are. We're taking steps to address these gaps. We're using technology at greater levels to assess risks and claims. And we're working hard to make insurance more accessible for people and businesses. But we can't do it by ourselves. We need a whole of society approach. Policymakers can create and need to create environments in which risks can be managed and mitigated. And both Tim and I have pointed out that there's recommendations on actions, best thinking from our experts around the world, actions that can really make a difference, that can be applied jurisdictionally. But we feel this report is a true roadmap that can help focus dialogue that will lead to change.
So can you give an example of what policymakers can do to help? Maybe we start again with Tim first and then over to you, Susan.
Well, in the area of natural catastrophe, policymakers can make a huge difference by ensuring that they enforce strong land use controls and building codes. So, often we think Mother Nature is to blame for these disasters, but it's where we've built and how we've built that actually creates the vulnerability. So if we look at where what activities we permit on land, where people are located, and the resilience through building codes, that will help mitigate future losses. And here insurance can help too, because insurers are experts on modeling catastrophe risk. We can use our flood models, for instance, to help inform authorities to make the right decisions about the permitted uses on land. So, and that's why it's really important in many jurisdictions to have open access to insurance and reinsurance. So that level of expertise, as well as that capital supporting risk transfer, is in place. Similarly, in cyber, where we have huge gaps, a lot of it is down to lack of awareness, particularly at the small business level. And there again, educational programs supported by, for instance, a government, but also supporting insurers to be able to ask those questions about the risks that a small business faces. And in doing that, identifying the vulnerabilities so that those can be addressed. And if they are addressed, then the premiums that would be put forward to that business would be less than they otherwise would have done, and you would have a more a resilient business. So insurance and governments working together can help close those protection gaps in those two areas.
And Susan, one example on your side.
Well, I'll focus on pensions again, the largest of the risk protection gaps that the report identified. And I think helpfully the report offers recommendations on both constructive things that policymakers can consider and things that we don't believe are constructive or have proven not to be constructive. Policies that advance financial education and the importance of savings are helpful. Policies that increase access to retirement savings plans are extremely helpful. We just passed a big bipartisan piece of legislation in the states, which is an example of how policy can increase access to retirement savings for part-time workers. It can make it easier for small employers to offer retirement plans through tax credits. And there is also a provision that has the government making matching contributions directly into taxpayers' IRAs or retirement plans for low and moderate income workers. So all good stuff that we think will really help advance progress in closing the pension or retirement savings gap in the states. On the side of what we think is not constructive or productive, policies that limit access to financial advisors that serve the middle and working class families or middle class market. We've had issues with that here in the States and in a couple of other countries. And this in spite of the fact that we have a clear approach being implemented across our US states and blessed by our US Securities and Exchange Commission that would increase consumer protections and preserve access to financial advisors for that important middle and working class segment of the market. Another example of we don't like policies or we think are very counterproductive policies that defund private pension systems. And we've seen that emerge in some parts of the world. So bottom line, Michaela, this GFIA report really brings together the global community's best thinking and examples from around the world. What is constructive, what isn't, and we think and we hope and believe it will start a rich conversation on solutions.
Well, thank you both very much. I think there is, in a way, a danger of finding the size and complexity of these gaps overwhelming. But I also believe that we are all united in our conviction that by working together, sustainable long-term strategies can be found for reducing them. And it is also clear that increasing the protection of individuals and businesses must be a shared responsibility. Certainly, the insurance industry looks forward to discussing the findings in this report with policymakers and to working with them to reduce the gaps. I hope you all find food for thought when you read our report. And thanks again to you, Susan, and to you, Tim, for your interventions and explanations.